Hello everyone, as mentioned before, in the next 1 or 2 videos, this series of tutorial videos will be over. So in this part, after adding 2 new scatter nodes to the graph, we will finalize it and we will not make any other changes in it. Then we edit the scene using editing tools and world tools and make the necessary changes. Next we will learn how to add a new terrain layer to the project, and finally, by going to the VFX tab, we will add more visual effects to our scene. To get started, go to the Biomes tab and add a new tree layer next to the previous layers in the graph. This time I use the prefab of a dead tree to bring the scene closer to the natural environment. After setting the necessary parameters and filtering the building layers, in the input section, I attribute it to Area Mixer 23. This area mixer is responsible for extracting data related to trees in the graph. We continue our work by pressing the Generate button. Now to fill flat areas in the scene, I add a layer of grass with very low density to this parts. By setting the necessary parameters in the input section, we attribute this layer to Area Mixer 9412, which we had previously intended to cover these areas. Press the Generate button to update the changes. Here the process of making our graph is complete, so save the graph to finish it and start the scene editing step. Note that because we will no longer add a new node to the graph, so whatever changes we make to the scene with its save, the changed items will remain constant. For example, to get higher performance, I slightly increase the placement distance of a layer of trees that contains the largest volume in the scene. By changing the scale range parameter, I bring the arrangement of this layer of trees closer to what is in nature. As you can see, the change is quite noticeable. As I mentioned before, you can use the Edit Placement tool to edit each layer individually and customize your scene to your liking. All layers of the graph are accessible from the TerraWorld subdirectory. Edit your scene to your liking by selecting any of them and going to the Inspector section. As example, in order to limit this model of trees to a certain height, we need to change the height range parameter to limit it to the favorable height. Also, by changing the slope range parameter, I will limit its coverage for slopes higher than 45 degrees. Remember to save your scene after each change. To have more control over editing each layer, we can select the other layers that make up the scene from the hierarchy section and disable them in the Inspector section to edit the favorable layer with more nobility. Our basis was to automate the graph and scene formation process, so in some cases the models may not be in the right place. To solve this, we use the editing tool to remove or add corrections. After applying the changes, I will continue working by saving the scene. Do the same correction process for other layers. Now I do the same process for the grass layers. TerraWorld makes it easy for you to adjust how each layer is arranged on the terrain layer's surface in the scene. By changing the exclusion percentage of this layer on the texture that is responsible for covering the low slope surfaces in the scene, we reduce its coverage below the water surface to the minimum available. Then we apply the same process to the textures that are responsible for covering flowways. The result will be tangible and impressive. Now make the same changes we made in the previous layer on this layer, because the arrangement of these two layers are similar to each other. Continue to work by adjusting the parameters of the next layer. End this section by saving the scene. It's time to use the powerful Edit World tool. This editor is very efficient in level design discussion. Because all the layers of the graph in this section can be isolated, removed or even painted. For example, we can draw all the layers we created in our graph by holding down the left mouse button, then by isolating one of the layers, we can delete only that layer. TerraWorld's other surprise is the Live Sync Mode section. To use this option, select the main terrain from the TerraWorld subcategory in the Hierarchy section, and in the inspector, take advantage of the features built into the terrain section. As you can see, the changes I make are updated immediately depending on the type of operation. If the Undo Operations option is on, simply retrieve the operation step by step by pressing the Ctrl-Z at the same time. Here, I am going to show you how to add a new terrain layer to the scene by creating it. By using the textures in the project, I create this new layer called Road 1. I will continue to work by attributing the necessary items. First we select the main terrain from the hierarchy, then by referring to the inspector section, we select the paint texture from the terrain category. I will use this new layer to draw the road in the scene, so after settings the brush, I will draw the wanted path in the scene. To complete this process, select TerraWorld from the hierarchy section and continue working in the inspector by clicking on the Edit World option. By referring to the new layer in the filter placement section, it is possible for us to filter all the layers in the scene from this layer by changing the exclusion percentage parameter. The changes are sensible. Now apply the same process to the grass layers. Likewise, you can select the new terrain layer from within the project and in the inspector section, change the parameters until you achieve the favorable result. You can even easily replace the new layer with the old layers. Now to use the unique features of TerraWorld, just go to the Terrain tab and edit the new layer by going to the Terrain Layers section. If terrain rendering is in Terraformer mode, you can have up to 8 layers of texture in your scene. All the settings that we have considered for this layer will be applied in the scene by redrawing it. Be sure to save your scene. Now it's time for the VFX tab. This part is responsible for adjusting the visual effects in the scene. By turning off this section, the scene becomes Unity default. All the changes that we apply in this tab will be completely tasteful and will also be visible in real time. In the day-night cycle section, the way of sunlight and also the speed of climate change can be adjusted. Ray section, here is how to adjust the ambient light volume. I set these options by default. In the cloud section, the height, density, color of the clouds as well as the material of the clouds can be adjusted. You can use the atmosphere scattering section to cover distant points in the scene, or in other words, to create a more visual dimension in the scene. By using the volumetric fog option, you can easily change the feeling and mood in the scene and create beautiful visual effects. It is time to set the wind parameter in the scene. In this section, the amount and speed of wind can be adjusted depending on your taste. Horizon fog is off by default in the project. Now by turning on this option, you will be able to access its parameters. The operation of this section is in the form of automatic and manual settings. For example, by changing the scene blend mode section, the way the clouds are displayed in the scene can be changed in a tangible way. One of the most obvious natural elements in the scene is the snow. You can easily change the mood of your scene by changing the parameters related to this section. Then, by referring to the water option, the possibility of changing the quality of water material or the way the environment reflects on water can be adjusted. Of course, turning on the planar reflection option will greatly affect the performance of the scene. You can also see how the other options work in the scene. In the post-processing section, by clicking on the Edit button, the items related to this section will be accessible and editable. As an example, in the color grading parameter, I changed the saturation and contrast slightly to give the scene more color and glaze. In addition, all items related to post-processing are stored in one profile. At the end, in the Advanced Settings section, you will be able to reset all changes to the default mode, or by clicking on the Edit icon, you will be able to access more settings in the VFX theme.